They said the jungle had its own pulse, that if you stood still long enough, you could feel it breathing through the fog. The canopy above swallowed the last of the daylight, and the air grew heavy with the scent of damp soil and cordite. The platoon moved like ghosts, boots sinking into mud, rifles trembling slightly under the weight of silence. Somewhere behind the rain and the humming of unseen insects, the whispers began. Faint, almost intimate. A voice calling from the darkness, speaking each man's name, as though it had always known it. It wasn't the enemy. It wasn't human. The men didn't speak of it at first, pretending it was the wind, but the wind never remembered your name. Night pressed against the camp like a living thing. The men sat in a crooked circle, their faces flickering under the glow of a single lantern that seemed too fragile for what surrounded them. No one spoke of the voices anymore, but the silence said everything. Radios crackled faintly, static humming in rhythm with something unseen. One of them swore he heard his mother's voice in the stat. Another said his name came back to him in perfect pitch. Fear wasn't the enemy here. Recognition was. Because whatever was out there didn't just mimic, it remembered. The radio operator tuned through bands that didn't exist on any military chart. Static hissed, cracked, and reshaped itself into something human. A woman's voice whispered coordinates no one had issued. Then, beneath it came laughter. Low, wrong, but familiar. Reed leaned closer, recognizing something in the tone, something that mirrored his own voice filtered through machine and madness. The jungle wasn't empty. It was listening, recording, and now it was answering back. They found the footprints first. Fresh, deep, but leading in circles. The patrol that left at dawn hadn't returned, yet their prints reappeared around camp, looping endlessly. Reed followed them through the fog, his men trailing close. The deeper they went, the more the air thinned. The trail ended abruptly at a clearing where the ground shimmered like liquid glass. Then came the smell. Not rot, not earth, but electricity. Something moved beneath the soil, murmuring every one of their names. The night broke open. Voices erupted not from the jungle, but from within. Each man heard something different. A father, a friend, a dead comrade. Reed dropped to his knees, covering his ears, but the sound came from inside his skull, vibrating through bone. The lanterns blew out. For one perfect second, the jungle fell silent again, as though holding its breath to see who would survive the listening. By dawn, command had gone silent. The radios that once carried their lifeline were now only static graves of lost voices. Reed gathered what was left of his unit. The silence pressed down on them like a weight, flattening thought and reason. Each footstep echoed too loudly. Then, not at all. Fletcher said he couldn't hear his own breathing. Ruiz mouthed words that made no sound. The jungle had swallowed every vibration, every syllable, as though the air itself had turned against them. Orders meant nothing now. Survival had no language. They reached the ridge by noon, where an old French outpost rotted in the vines. Its metal bones creaked in windless air, and graffiti etched in rusted steel spelled names they recognized. Theirs. Fletcher rubbed the letters as if testing for truth. The silence cracked once. A dry twig, or maybe a breath. Then the jungle answered with their own voices, played backward and slowed. Somewhere deep beneath that soundless canopy, the valley recorded and replayed them, fragment by fragment, until even memory betrayed its owner. Beneath the outpost they found stairs leading down. Concrete slick with moisture, reeking of iron and rot. The deeper they descended, the more a hum filled the air, like machinery buried under the earth. Lights flickered weakly, fed by unseen power. Then, at the bottom, a sealed door. On its surface, a speaker grill whispered fragments of human speech. The last words of soldiers long dead, layered in metallic chorus. Reed pressed his ear against it and froze. He heard his own voice say, "Turn back." At 1900 hours, their radio came alive. Static built, shaped, and turned into a signal too precise to be coincidence. A voice, female, monotone, identified itself as Central Command Echo. It delivered coordinates, the same ridge they stood on, followed by a repeating sequence. 7113. Fletcher recorded it, but when they played it back, it wasn't words anymore. It was screaming their own. The coordinates changed every playback, as if the valley itself was rewriting the mission in real time. They reached the far edge by nightfall. The jungle opened to a crater filled with water so still, it mirrored the stars without distortion. In the reflection, their faces moved out of sync, smiling when they weren't, blinking too slowly, whispering names they hadn't spoken aloud. Reed looked up. The real stars didn't match what lay below. The reflection was its own sky, its own world, swallowing light and returning only memory. When the wind came again, it didn't rustle leaves. It whispered command codes. By morning, the maps had changed. Grid lines shifted. Rivers curved where none existed the night before, and entire villages disappeared. The paper itself seemed alive. The ink glistening under sunlight, bleeding into new shape. Fletcher swore it was the same terrain, only rewritten. Reed traced the coordinates from the last transmission. 711. It was making one, rewriting geography like it was memory on a tape, erasing the men as it went. They followed the spiral to its center. A clearing littered with rusted helmets and torn webbing. Beneath the soil, the metal echoed hollow when struck. They dug, uncovering a steel cylinder, the size of a coffin. Its surface bore faded markings, U.S. Army Signal Corps, 1954. The war hadn't even begun then. Reed wiped the mud away, revealing a single etched phrase, "Speak to hear." When they opened it, the smell of ozone filled the air, and a faint hum whispered their names in chorus. When they wired the cylinder to the radio set, the speakers didn't hum, they breathed. A low inhale, a wet exhale, and then voices poured through, blending into static waves. Dozens at once. Some called for medevac, others recited coordinates. Then came the voices they recognized, members of their own platoon, those still alive and standing in that very clearing. Fletcher ripped the headset off, screaming that he could hear himself from inside it. Ruiz whispered prayers in Spanish. Reed said nothing. He was listening for orders that weren't human anymore. At 300 hours, the radio resumed on its own. A calm, flat voice repeated, "Coordinate 7113. Acknowledged." "Deploy retrieval team." Reed checked the map. The numbers aligned over their own position again. Then new voices joined in, listing names from the roster. Every man marked Kia. Fletcher's name came last. He turned to Reed, shaking his head, whispering, "It's already happened." The valley wasn't reporting the dead. It was scheduling them. They recorded everything. The whispers, the voices, the screams, and played it back through a reel-to-reel machine salvaged from the outpost. The tape whirred, catching and stuttering. At first it played their transmissions, then their own breathing, then silence. Finally, a single voice emerged. Act 3 complete. Proceed to next recording. Reed looked up from the machine. Fletcher was gone. Ruiz stared at the empty seat, realizing the valley wasn't just listening. It was directing. Somewhere, in another loop of this same jungle, the same men were still walking, still being recorded, still hearing their own names whispered back to them. Dawnham arrived as if edited in, a hard cut from black to gray, and with it, a transmission that shouldn't exist. The radio keyed itself, carrier wave steady as a surgeon's hand, and delivered a briefing in Reed's own cadence, word for word, from a mission he hadn't given yet. Grid 7113. Approach from the south. Suppressive fire in 3 volleys. It was precise, clinical, inevitable. Ruiz stared at the handset like it might grow teeth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, branches cracked in the exact rhythm of bootsteps they hadn't taken. The map on the crate pulsed with damp, the spiral tightening as if ink could breathe. Reed felt the truth land. They weren't receiving new orders. They were inside the recording that issued them. The jungle waited, patient as a trigger finger, certain they would march into its mouth because they already had. The only choice left was where to stand when the loop closed. They heard him before they saw him, gear clinking with the familiar staccato of routine. The rhythm of a man you trusted not to die. Fletcher stepped out of the fog, uniform neat, boots clean, eyes too still. He carried the reel-to-reel like a talisman and spoke in phrases that matched Reed's memory, but not his breath. Ruiz tried to hug him and met a posture that didn't yield, like a photograph pressed back into its frame. Fletcher reported contact at the crater, claimed he'd flanked and cleared, then asked for authorization to initiate the same plan they'd failed last night and hadn't attempted yet. Reed kept his rifle low and his questions lower, testing call and response codes only the living get wrong. Fletcher passed everyone, but missed the joke at the end. The human scene. The jungle inhaled faintly, recording them all, and Reed decided to walk behind the returning dead to see which way the tracks pointed. They formed a line along the ridge where the map insisted their future firing positions already existed. Sandbags appeared that none of them remembered filling. Empty shell casings lay warm to the touch. Fletcher briefed a kill box, designation nobody had cleared, calling its 0 like a joke about beginnings that double as endings. Reed marked sectors, felt muscle memory guide his hand, watched Ruiz flinch to an impact that hadn't landed yet. The air sharpened, birds vanished from the soundtrack. The jungle's breath narrowed to a thin sine tone. On Reed's count, a number he swore not to say. Their rifles kicked in unison, echoing a volley he recognized from last night's tape. Return fire came late and wrong, a distant pop from coordinates that matched their own. Reed saw dirt spit from behind them and realized they were suppressing themselves, a loop with no enemy but delay. He ordered ceasefire, and the valley obeyed like an editor hitting stop. Artillery solved problems. Command always said, even the philosophical ones. Fletcher read a fire mission into a net that was dead, and somehow answered. Grid 713. Smoke, adjust, fire for effect. The horizon lifted in a delayed bloom. Not where they aimed, but where they stood a minute ago, as if the shells hunted their absence. Reed grabbed the handset and spoke only silence, shaping breaths into pauses the valley would misread. The correction returned anyway. Reed's voice clipped and certain, authorizing impact on their current position. Ruiz stared at the sky and whispered for the voice to say his name so he'd know where to run. The first round landed with polite precision 20 meters short, carving a neat circle in the mud, like a phonograph needle finding a groove. The second round never arrived. The jungle exhaled, and the crater filled with a reflection none of them wanted to check. The tape clicked somewhere no one touched, and the world softened at the edges. The map relaxed its spiral as if satisfied with an answer. Fletcher set the reel-to-reel on a stump and stepped back like a priest from an altar. From its speaker, the patrol's banter unspooled. Jokes about rations they hadn't told yet. The slap of a magazine seeded that would happen in 30 seconds. Ruiz laughing in a voice that belonged to a man who still believed in morning. Reed walked to the machine and looked down at the reflection of sky in its polished reel. The same false stars from the crater trapped in metal circles. He lifted the power switch. The jungle whispered his name. Then all their names. Then the word again. Reed didn't pray. He counted backward, a new number that wasn't on the tape, and told Ruse to follow a path no map could print. The loop tight. They stepped out anyway. The path led them back to the crater, though none remembered turning. The jungle's geography folded in on itself, paths repeating with surgical precision, each tree an echo of the last. The crater no longer shimmered silver. It pulsed a dull red from beneath, like veins glowing through black glass. Reed ordered Ruiz to stay behind, but Ruiz only shook his head. He'd heard his own laughter down there, faint and wet, calling for help. The surface moved when they approached, not from wind, but from recognition. Reed saw his reflection tilt its head before he did. The water whispered coordinates that rearranged with every ripple. Fletcher stood behind them, hands clasped, face patient as a teacher waiting for his students to understand the lesson. The jungle wasn't breathing anymore. It was listening, recording their thoughts before they spoke. The first step into the crater felt like stepping through film stock. Light bending, sound muffled, colors bleeding into memory. Reed sank waist deep, the liquid thick, metallic, humming. Ruiz followed, whispering prayers in Spanish that came out reversed. The surface closed above them, erasing the world in a single blink. Below, light drifted like static across their faces, illuminating helmets, rifles, fragments of past missions preserved in perfect clarity. A rusted dog tag floated by with Reed's name scratched twice. One old, one new. Fletcher's voice guided them deeper, though his body hadn't followed. Down there, the laws of time played on repeat, splicing their every motion into infinite retakes. The deeper they went, the louder the jungle played back their own lives. Not as memory, but as rehearsal. At the bottom waited a chamber not carved, but grown. Roots woven through concrete, steel bones from wars that never ended. In the center, a black box, the size of a coffin, humming with stored voices. The emblem etched into its face wasn't US or French. It was something older, a sigil that resembled a radio dial merging with an ear. Reed brushed mud from it and felt heat, heartbeat steady under his fingertips. Ruiz begged him not to open it, said he could hear crying inside, 100 voices repeating the same word. Listen. Reed opened the latch. The sound didn't emerge. It inhaled. The jungle above gasped. The reflection on the surface shifted, showing men still climbing down, again and again, an endless descent. When the recorder spoke, it wasn't sound. It was memory, forced through air. The chamber filled with scenes they hadn't lived yet. Reed firing into fog. Ruiz falling. Fletcher speaking coordinates alone. The voices overlapped, building until the noise inverted into perfect silence. In that absence, Reed saw the truth. Each mission was just playback, the Valley's way of keeping soldiers immortal through repetition. They were all fragments of the same broadcast, their fear archived and looped for eternity. Ruiz screamed, but no sound came. Only the hiss of the next cycle beginning. Reed reached for the recorder, hand trembling, and whispered his own name, daring the jungle to remember it correctly this time. The jungle exhaled once more, and light returned. Not dawn, but the bleached white of erasure. Reed awoke on the ridge, uniform dry, radio humming softly beside him. No ruse, no Fletcher, just static forming the rhythm of his heartbeat. He keyed the mic, spoke a single word. Listen. And the jungle answered with his voice, crisp and clear, ordering himself to move to grid 713. He smiled faintly, the first real emotion in days, maybe years. The trees leaned in, the fog thickened, and the sound of bootsteps began again, matching his own. The tape had reset. The Valley was ready to record another version of the same story. One man, one mission, one endless repetition of orders no one ever gave. They said the jungle didn't have ghosts, just soldiers who'd gone too quiet to find their way back. At first, Reed thought the silhouettes ahead were rescue. The shapes moved with purpose, forming tactical patterns, rifles raised in mirrored rhythm. But when he called out, they called back. Same voice, same inflection, same breath. The echo wasn't sound anymore. It was a reflection that bled through reality. Ruiz had been among them, But the man leading that opposite patrol was Reed himself. Older, uniform frayed, face half covered in soot. The air vibrated like magnetic tape caught in rewind. For every step Reed took forward, his double advanced in perfect counter. Rifles aimed not at the enemy but at each other. Two sides of the same operation, split by time, stitched by signal. Somewhere above, the jungle watched, curious to see which version would survive the playback. The firefight lasted seconds, or maybe it never began. Every trigger pull echoed through frequencies instead of sound. Bullets dissolved into static midair. The jungle rippled, bark vibrating with subsonic resonance. Reed dropped his rifle, realizing the noise was more weapon than metal. The other Reed did the same. Between them, the air split open, a waveform visible, thrumming, composed of thousands of whispered names. Each voice spoke coordinates, missions, death times, the records of men lost in every war this valley had ever devoured. The waveform compressed into a perfect circle and burst outward, shattering sound itself. For a heartbeat, everything was pure tone, white and infinite. Then the silence returned, sharper than gunfire. The war wasn't fought for ground anymore. It was fought for signal. The world stuttered, frames repeating. Reed blinked, and suddenly the firefight replayed from a new angle, as if edited by unseen hands. Fletcher's voice came through the static, reciting orders in a tone stripped of emotion. He was command now, broadcasting from nowhere. Each time Reed tried to move, his body snapped back 2 seconds, forced to relive the same gesture until he obeyed. The radio on his belt whispered lines of dialogue before he spoke them. The mission brief repeated. Same coordinates, same weather, same outcome. The war had become self-sustaining, a perfect feedback circuit of cause and consequence. Reed finally understood. None of them were soldiers anymore. They were recordings, forever playing their last operation, waiting for a listener to press stop. Deep under the crater, another outpost came alive, its walls vibrating with faint Morse tones. Reed followed the echoes through a corridor lined with hanging microphones, each one dripping condensation like tears. The room at the end wasn't a bunker, but a recording studio. Reels stacked to the ceiling, all labeled with names, ranks, and death dates. A console glowed with the insignia of the Signal Corps, now pulsing like a heartbeat. When Reed touched the dials, the microphones lifted on their cords, turning toward him as if awaiting confession. A voice from the intercom, his own years older, welcomed him to Command Below, where the mission never ends. Only records. Reed spoke, and the system began rewriting the tape, erasing his silence. When the broadcast ended, Reed heard footsteps approach, slow, synchronized, metallic. The other Reed stepped into the light, no longer mirror, but flesh. His face was calm, tired, half smeared with red dust. "You made it further this time," he said, voice breaking through layers of distortion. Reed asked who was recording. The answer came not from him, but from the microphones above. "You are." In that instant, Reed saw the studio from another angle, himself seated at the console, adjusting levels, listening to playback. The static rose to a roar. The older Reed saluted, then dissolved into signal noise, leaving only the hum of a new recording starting. Reed sat down at the controls. The reel spun, capturing his breath. Outside, the jungle exhaled, satisfied the loop would continue. The jungle had grown still again. No wind, no breath, no sound. Reed sat before the console, its reels turning counterclockwise, recording backward. The speakers whispered every operation he'd ever survived, layered in reverse, each word unspooling from ending to beginning. When the static cleared, a woman's voice spoke softly. "Final transmission initiate. Operator, Sergeant Marcus Reed." He didn't remember starting it, but the log blinked confirmation. The air shimmered as if electromagnetic charge had replaced oxygen. Outside, trees bent toward the bunker, drawn by the signal's gravity. Reed realized the recorder was no longer playing memories. It was rewriting them, pulling reality back through the coil. Somewhere in the white hiss, Ruiz laughed again, distant, unaged. Fletcher hummed a marching cadence that had no origin. The system wanted one more recording. The last man in the valley describing how silence sounds when it becomes alive. At 100 hours, the frequency changed pitch. Too low for human ears, yet it vibrated the walls. Dust fell like ash. Reed watched the waveform crawl across the monitor, each spike aligning with a heartbeat that wasn't his. The radio crackled, then emitted a sequence of tones. Not Morse, not code, but a voice flattened into pure electricity. He recognized the pattern, the same hum that came from the crater when the first patrol vanished. The frequency wasn't broadcasting, it was feeding, growing stronger with each second. Reed stepped back as the microphones began to melt, cables writhing like veins. The static formed his own silhouette on the wall. Standing, waiting, listening. He reached toward it and felt warmth, pulse, and the faintest trace of his own voice asking him to let go. When he touched the wall, everything folded inward. The studio, the jungle, the war, all compressed into a single pulse of light. Reed found himself standing in a field of fog, his boots sinking into water that reflected the night sky. Dozens of soldiers stood around him, motionless, eyes open, but empty. They weren't dead, just paused between frames, waiting for sound. A single radio floated above the water, its antenna pointed skyward, emitting faint static shaped like breathing. Fletcher's voice drifted from it. End of file not found. Reed knelt, touching the device, feeling the texture of wet metal under his fingertips. The static parted, revealing a recording of his own heartbeat. In the silence between beats, he heard the jungle whisper its final order. Transmit. He pressed the transmit key, and the world began recording itself. The stars reappeared, not in the sky but in the water, mapping out the shape of the valley. Each ripple turned into coordinates, spiraling outward from where he knelt. His voice emerged on every channel across the dead jungle. Calm, clear, deliberate. This is Sergeant Marcus Reed, last survivor of Echo Platoon. Coordinates 713. The jungle is alive. As he spoke, the water stilled, and the other soldiers turned toward him, faces softening as if memory returned. One by one, they saluted before fading into static rain. Reed smiled faintly, though his reflection didn't. The reflection leaned closer, lips moving without sound, mouthing words he already knew. The next line of the transmission. The transmission ended where it began, in the hum of a jungle learning to dream. Reed stood, the radio silent, the fog retreating to reveal dawn, breaking over terrain newly writ. There was no crater now, no camp, no war, only the slow rustle of leaves exhaling relief. He looked down at his hands. No mud, no weapon. Only light seeping through skin like signal through claw. A final tone echoed, faint but familiar, repeating 3 words. File successfully archived. The valley exhaled. The trees straightened. Somewhere beneath the soil, a new tape began to spin, clean and waiting. Reed turned once toward the invisible lens watching him and whispered, "Listen." Then the screen flickered, image degrading into static, the last frame freezing on his silhouette, dissolving into the fog. The jungle recording itself forever.